dangers and the wounds caused by systemic racism and poverty in this society. So we are here today to say together, it's time to choose life, America. It's time for us to do it together. It's time for a moral revolution of values. We can't pretend that the crisis we face is about a single individual in office or one political party alone. Sure, we're clear about what's being exacerbated, but even the current occupant of the White House benefited from a culture that had been cultivated ever since the death of Dr. King and even before. We know it's not just what the president doing, but what a regressive Senate, what a regressive Congress does. Far too long, our public leadership has been too comfortable with other folks' death. Truth of the matter is, Republicans racialize death and too many Democrats racialize poverty and too many Democrats run from poverty. It's time to say every piece of public policy has a death measurement on the down low. We don't talk about that often, but every piece of public policy, regressive piece of public policy has a death measurement on the down low. And it's been kept on the down low, but it's time to expose it now. Denying living wages and basic income has a death measurement. Denying health care has a death measurement. My son, William III, told me that 3,000 people die from particulate air pollution that comes from politicians protecting corporate polluters. When you protect corporate polluters, it has a death measurement. And it's past time to reject the culture of death. Even racist voter suppression has a death measurement. Because when racist voter suppression is used to help people get elected, who once they get elected, they block health care, they block living wages, and they protect greedy corporations, then voter suppression is used in a way that produces a death measurement. And like the prophet Ezekiel said in scripture, it's not only the politicians who've been acting as ravenous wolves, that's the biblical language, it's also the lying religionists who cover up for them. And it's time to reject and alter the policies of greed, violence, and racism that hurt, harm, and destroy lives. As Ross Pellis likes to say, we need an analysis.
Reverend William
It's time
Barber.
to embrace an agenda rooted in the deepest values of our faith traditions, our highest and best political and intellectual visions, the values closest to the heart within each of us: love, justice, mercy, and truth. It's time to demand that we, the people, live up to our stated commitment to establish justice, promote the general welfare, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, and guarantee every American equal protection under the law. It's time. In fact, it's past time. But also it's time for a major transformation and reconstruction. In recent weeks, we've heard the media ask, when will the protests stop? Since we've launched this campaign, people have asked, what one demand is your top priority? Well, we say, when you decided to do COVID response, you gave $2.5 trillion, nearly $3 trillion to the banks and the corporations. If they can have 3 trillion things, don't ask us what is our one thing. We are not asking for one thing. We are demanding that this nation reconstruct everything. We are demanding that for the sake of the people who would choose policies of life, liberation, and love. In this campaign, we know things don't have to be kept the way they are. We know that. We know that if we instituted fair elections and restricted the influence of big money in our politics, we could transition to automatic online voter registration and give life to our democracy by ensuring eligible voters can vote. We don't have to choose death. We can choose life. We need to understand that many of the things we're seeing don't have to be. They are bad choices. People in line now trying to get food, bad choices. People without health care comes from bad choices. People without sick leave and basic and decent unemployment because of bad choices. money going to the corporations in the middle of the pandemic rather than going to the community. Bad choices. And if we change, the nation can change. If we want to have a heroes bill, yes, make sure there's money in there for city and municipal workers so we can save the jobs of public service workers, but also guarantee health care, but also guarantee living wages, but also guarantee sick leave, but also guarantee rent forgiveness, but also put a moratorium on people's utilities being cut off. We can do this and have life. If we instituted a $15 minimum wage immediately, we would raise pay for 49 million workers by $328 billion per year. 49 million people would come up out of poverty and low wealth. If we implemented a housing wage, we could raise pay for 83 million workers and by more than $1 trillion going into the economy. This would give life to our households and our economy. If we end mass incarceration, as Liz said, we could significantly reduce the $179 billion that currently goes to policing and courts and prison. And this would give life to our communities and raise resources to secure housing for all. If we stop pouring money and resources into a border wall, we could move that $24 billion into children's K-12 education and give life to their dreams. If we canceled one military contract, we would have $25 billion to expand Medicaid in the 14 states that haven't already done so under the Affordable Care Act. This would mean life for millions of people in those states who are still uninsured in the midst of a pandemic. If we canceled another military contract, we would have more than enough resources to put towards expanding our water infrastructure and creating 945,000 jobs. Instead of putting those resources in war, we would support life because water is life. If we cut $350 billion from the military budget and close some of the 800 bases, we would still have more money than China and North Korea and Iran and Iraq combined. But we could make the world a more safer place and put those resources toward health care and lifting our people. If we had put $6.4 trillion that we've poured into endless wars since 9/11, if we had put that money into green energy, we would have built a renewable energy grid by now with nearly $2 trillion to spare. If we restore the corporate tax rate to what it was before the Trump tax cuts, we would raise $130 billion per year. This would be more than enough resources to fund the $100 billion we need to provide early child care and education for every child in this country. They could live. If we instituted a tiny tax on Wall Street trades, we would raise more than the $70 billion we need to invest in free public college for all. If we implemented a wealth tax on the richest households in the country, we would raise $270 billion a year to put toward fixing our public infrastructure. If we tax inherited wealth fairly, we could raise $78 billion a year, and we could use that to close the racial wealth gap by putting in baby bonds programs that would establish a savings account with resources for every American child. If we repented of the injustices against indigenous people and implemented fair policies for undocumented Americans and homeless Americans, we could change our present and our future and have a true healing from our past. Now, I know somebody's out there to say, well, did you get that from the Democrats? Did you get that from the progressive? No, got it from the Bible. Jesus said that every nation is going to be judged by how it treats the poor, how it treats the least of these, how it treats the sick and the hungry and in prison. Got it from the prophets of that Jews, Muslims, and Christians honor. Isaiah 10 said, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. It's time. The worst mistake we could make now with all of this marching and protesting in the street would be to demand too little. And we have the capacity to change the political conversation in this country. And it's time. 23 million poor and low-income people who were eligible to vote in 2016 didn't vote. Many of them, they tell us because they never hear politicians talking about their issues. About 107,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan decided the presidential election. In those three states alone, nearly 2 million poor and low-income people who did not vote in 2016 are eligible to register and vote in 2020. According to a forthcoming study we've done with Columbia University. In the South, 8.9 million poor and low wealth people who could have voted didn't vote. Why don't many of them vote? Because they say they never hear their issues of poverty. If we want to change the electorate, if we want to change the political calculus, we have to start talking to poor and low wealth people and stop lying on poor and low wealth people, white and black. Most poor and low wealth people did not vote for the current administration. Many of them did not vote because nobody comes and visits them and talks to them and listens to them and hears their stories and says in their policies how they're going to address the issue of poverty. We have the power to change the office holders. And then we have the power to get pressure on them, nonviolent, civil disobedient pressure if necessary, to push our agenda. We have power for in the streets, in the suites, in the voting booths, in the pulpits. We have power, nonviolent power, and it's time to use it. It's not only time, it's past time. It's our time. And when we come together and vote together and work together, we can change and remake the systems of government to serve all people. And then finally, it's time to move together and to refuse to be divided. Our mantra is somebody's been hurting our people, and it's gone on far too long. We won't be silent anymore. It is a cry against the nation's long train of abuses, rooted deeply in systemic racism and systemic poverty. When we say forward together, not one step back, Rob, it is a call to the kind of unity needed to answer the time we live in. It's the only thing that has ever revived the hope of a democracy. In every moment of potential reconstruction, there has been a moral fusion gathering. When poor white farmers and formerly enslaved voters realized it was time to form a fusion party across the South and to face down domestic terrorist organizations and white supremacy campaigns, they were able to move together. When multicultural coalitions decided it was time to come together in a labor movement after World War I, the corporate powers attacked them as socialists and used racist fear and political ideology because they were scared of people coming together. But in the 1920s, A. Philip Randolph and his friends and his allies organized a strike against the powerful Pullman Company, and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters became the backbone of the civil rights in America for generations. In Flint, Michigan, in 1937, the United Auto Workers took over factories and became a force to reckon with, and a mighty labor movement was born. If you like the 8-hour day and the weekend, you owe it to labor organizers who came together across racial lines. And when poor white folk decided it was time to join black folks and Native Nations Chicano workers, the Poor People's Campaign 50 years ago was founded. And as we face a pandemic, we know America has a long history of dividing people, blaming Chinese or the Mexicans or Spanish or the Indians for disease in the past, scapegoating people by nationality. We know the tricks, but we also know when we decide it's time to unite, oh, there's power. There's power when we come together. And truth is, when you hold on to the truth, justice has never lost. During slavery, it looked like justice had lost, but when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some Quakers, Liz, and white evangelicals decided it was time to get together, they formed this fusion movement that brought about abolition. Women didn't have the right to vote, but then Sojourner Truth and others decided it's time. Lucretia Mott, time. Mother Jones, it's time. And they won the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the victory, but when Thurgood Marshall got white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers and said it's time to take on Plessy, they did it and they won. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten down injustice, couldn't rise again. But when Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, Bayard Rustin, who was gay, decided it was time to get with white folk like Glenn Smiley and Jonathan Daniels and Viola Wusso and James Reed, when they got together, they tore Jim Crow down. And so we've come together today between Juneteenth and June 21st, the summer solstice, to say it's time. It's time to be real free. Not just free, real free. And it's time to show some light in dark places. And that means each of us in this moment needs to take some inventory of our own time on this earth. Let me close here. I don't mean to be morbid, but in this pandemic, we must be honest about the fact that any one of us could be 48 hours from our last breath. I ask you today, if you knew you were going to take your last breath in 48 hours, what would you use your last breath to fight for? What kind of world would you want to breathe life into for the next generation? What would you use your last breaths for if you knew they were just a day or so away? Well, it's time to live like our last breath could come any moment. It's time to use every breath left in our bodies to fight for love and truth and justice. It's time to believe again. It's time to challenge the lie about not having resources. It's time to believe and work as though we are sure that love is still greater than hate. The truth is still greater than lies. It's time to believe and work as though we are sure that the hungry can be fed, that the sick can be insured and cured, that immigrants can be welcomed, that the war machinery can be cut. It's time to believe that black and white and poor and Latino people in the South can be organized into a new powerful coalition for change. It's time to come together and vote like never before. It's time, whether you're black or brown or First Nation or Asian or whatever, or Latino, whoever you are, gay or straight or trans, young or old, from the rural or from the cities, it's time to believe that this heart and the soul of this democracy can live. We can breathe into it the spirit of a genuine democracy. It's time, even if it takes nonviolent resistance. It's time, with every breath we have, while we still have time. It's time to rise up. It's time to reconstruct. It's time to call for a moral revival that puts an America together that works for us all. It's time, as one songwriter said, to help somebody. It's time to show this world that is traveling wrong, this nation that is traveling wrong. It's time to show some beauty to a world upraught. It's time. This is why we're living. It's time to register. It's time to mobilize. It's time to educate. It's time. We are living in time for this time. It's time. It's time. It's time. Come on and join the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival, and let's do something in time to change time, because the time is right now.